The first thing is, and this is different than most electoral systems, including the Irish and the UK one, but in Europe they do have an equivalent list system. But in the United States, the elections are an indirect election. When people go to vote next Tuesday, they're not voting directly, even though they put Trump or Harris down to vote, they're voting for electors. So in the 50 United States and DC since 2000 and about 30 or 40 years on DC got the votes, but the American territories do not. And I put those only up last night after hearing Trump and his allies in Madison Square Gardens bad-mouthing the Puerto Rico. But Puerto Rico is an American territory, but they don't get to vote. And up until 40 or 50 years ago, neither did DC get to vote. But I'll come to that. And the other thing is, the president and vice president are the only elected federal officials chosen by the Electoral College instead of direct voting. So every other election in the United States is first past the post, like a lot of people are. And before people say, how could the United States have a complicated system like this? Let's not go too far away from home and understand the system we have in Ireland. We have proportional representation, yeah, but it's single transferable vote part of the proportional representation. Malta and Ireland are the only two countries I think that have that particular model. But I do think that it would be good that somebody here would take the Irish system. We all know people have over the quota and the votes are transferred. But how those votes transfer to 10 or 12 counts is a whole complicated scheme in itself. And I think very, very few people understand it. So maybe it's something we would do. But anyway, it's an indirect system. You don't vote directly for the president, you vote for these electors who form part of the Electoral College. Okay, it was in the Constitution, it's back since 1788, they originally established the Electoral College. And this was a result of a compromise, and we still see the effect of this compromise, between people who wanted Congress to elect the president directly and people who wanted a popular vote people. Now, when I read a bit about this, some of the people who wanted Congress said, oh, you couldn't let the general people vote. There would be a riot in the street. And so it was kind of an Irish solution to an American problem. They said, okay, we'll have a bit of both. We'll let the people vote, but they won't elect their president directly. And more importantly, on point 2, the Constitution says the state shall appoint the electors in such a manner as the legislature may direct. So it doesn't have to be by voting. And in some states, the local government appoint the electors. During the first presidential election in 1789, only 6 of the 11 states that voted chose their electors by any other form of popular vote. It's a bit like the county council would select them rather than the people. Now, here comes the bit that I only found out the last couple of days. The electors, even though once they're selected, do possess the legal prerogative to vote as they wish, and under extraordinary circumstances they might exercise that prerogative to change the expected outcome directed by the proper election results. They're called faithless electors. It did, and I have... okay, we'll see in a minute. So what happens beforehand is the parties, let's say California, 54 electoral votes. Before the election, both parties select 54 people. It's called the slate of electors. There's 54 Republicans, 54 Democrats. Now, when the election is over, one of those groups go home and not heard from anymore. In California, it'll be the Republicans who go home. It'll be the Democrats, because that's an out-and-out Democrat state. Those 54 people become the path to electing the president. We'll see about it in a minute. So anyway, but even though they're selected, they can make up their own mind. And there has been examples, and one famous one was where the person died in the meantime, and they couldn't vote for him. So each state casts as many electoral votes as the total number of its senators and representatives. So that's where it goes back to the people. The amount of senators and the amount of people in the House of Representatives is a reflection of the amount of people in the state. California has a lot of people, that's why it has a total of 54. The first part is controlled by the political parties in each state and varies from state to state. Generally, the parties nominate a slate of potential electors. So if we were doing this in Ireland, Fine Gael would have a slate of electors, Fianna Fáil would have a slate of electors. The thing that really we find hard to understand, with the exception of 2 states, we'll see them later, whoever wins that state gets all the votes. In the case of California, 54, it is whoever gets the popular vote gets all 54. There's no proportional representation at all. So, so the first thing is the local parties select the slate of electors. The second part happens during the general election when the voters in each state cast votes for the president candidate of their choice. They're voting to select the state electors. So if you're in California and you're voting, you're not voting directly for the president, you're voting for one of 2 slate of electors. One which are selected by the Republicans, one by the Democrats. You're selecting those. And the second part is when the potential elector's name may or may not appear on the ballot paper. I didn't know that. The name of the presidential candidate depending on election procedures and ballot formats in each state. So I have a copy of one later on which doesn't have the electors on it. So in some states it'll have the name, it'll have Trump, and it'll have a list of who the nominated electors for him are. I don't see why it makes much difference. So there's a thing called faithless elector laws, faithless electors, and there's laws that cover it. This is where people are selected by either party but vote in the opposite. In the 2024, 38 states and DC had laws that require electors to pledge to vote. Colorado was the first state to void any elector. They said if you vote against what your party said, you're gone, and they get somebody in their place. Washington became the first state to find faithless electors in 2016. In the Wakeout state, having 4, that's a very high amount, 4 faithless electors. I think they have a total of 12. In 2029, the state changes law for future elections to avoid faithless votes and replace the respective electors instead of firing them and fining them. In Washington, Democratic Party electors gave 3. They gave 3 of their. It was 12, so they had 3 of them went to Colin Powell, who wasn't on the election. Okay, this is the timeline. The election, on the 11th, nothing happens. This gives people a great chance to have legal proceedings, because nothing happens until December the 11th. The electors, this is December the 17th. Then the electors vote in their states. This is what they were doing in 2016 when he voted against it. Now, the state designates which place it'll take place and all, because when Trump started to have alternative electors, they went to they sneaked into the state house and did their own election, which was against the law. December the 25th, I know it's Christmas Day, but that's just, it's actually the 4th Wednesday in December. The votes have to arrive. January the 3rd, the archivist transfers the certificates to Congress, and Congress counts the votes on January 6th. And we all know what happened last January the 6th. So I suspect we'll have a bit of fireworks as well. Okay. In early January, the total electric vote is opened by the sitting vice president.
No,
yeah, Pence, yeah. Now, and we're about to see this, without doubt, I put this in because we're about to see this. Members of Congress are free to object to any of the state's electoral vote count, provided that the objection is presented in writing and signed by at least one member of each House of Congress. It's a valid objection. If the objection is submitted, both Houses in Congress adjourn to their respective chambers to debate and vote on the objection. The approval of both Houses in Congress is required to invalidate these electoral votes in question. Now, apart from the American election, presidential election, which we're all tied into, most important is at the same time is the election for both Houses of Congress, because they're the people who decide. If the Republicans have, and this is one thing Trump could use, if the Republicans have a majority in both houses, then all they need is someone to object. They go for a vote, and that's objected, and those electors are thrown out, and the Constitution says it goes back to the state to decide. If you remember back 2020, Trump and his people were saying, "Oh, let's put it back to the state. Let's put it back to the state." If it's a Republican state, they'll come back with a vote for Trump. So that's one thing they can do, and that's why there's a fair amount of pressure to make sure that the Republicans don't have the majority in both houses. Both houses have to approve, so that's the big stumbling block. At the moment, there's a one-vote majority in the Senate for Democrats, and the Republicans have a majority in the other. But that might change. But that's one way that Trump could seize the advantage, or seize an advantage and move against what the people wanted to do. There's another one as well. We'll come to that in a minute. Now, and people think that in Madison Square Garden, Trump said, "Oh, myself and the Speaker of the House have a surprise for you after the election." So it's possible that they have something like this planned. So this is, if no majority can exist, if they cannot decide on the majority, I put this in because this is likely to what happened. If no candidate receives an absolute majority, so it's not the most votes, you have to get an absolute majority. If no candidate receives an absolute majority of the votes, the President of the House of Representatives elects the President, and the Senate elects the Vice President. In 1824, the election was the only president election under the current system ever dictated by a contingent election. And that is probably what Trump is trying to do, a contingent election. It's to throw the whole January 6th into disarray, say we cannot normally elect it, and the Constitution said we'll go back to the House of Representatives. And they elected a different president than the candidate with a plurality of both the electoral and the popular vote. John Quincy Adams was. That's a whole other story. But representatives always have their hands in the president election. In response to that, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, requiring electors to cast two distinct votes. Before this, it was one vote. Now it's two distinct votes. One for president and one for vice president. While this solved the problem at hand, it reduced the prestige of the vice president, as the office was no longer held by the leading challenger for the presidency. The separate balance for president and vice president became something of a moot issue later in the 19th century, when it became the norm for popular elections to determine a state electoral college delegation. Electors chosen this way are pledged to vote for a particular president and vice president candidate offered by the same party. Although the president and vice president are legally elected separately, in practice they are chosen together. So it can't go back to, and it would be very interesting if you had a Republican president and a Democrat vice president, but it can't happen now. And what most people would know that in 2016 Trump didn't win the popular vote. So it was interesting, and I found this, starting at the bottom, there's 2016. Hillary Clinton got 48.2%, Trump got 46%, and yet he won. That is strange. Now, he did query that, and he set up a commission to look into it, but they went away because I figure they found out that it was nothing in it. Why is the election, I didn't know this, why is the election held on this particular day? The factors that involved this was weather, harvesting, and worship. You have to go back to when this started in the United States. There wasn't universal suffrage. You had to be a property owner to vote. No women had votes, and the slaves still hadn't got votes. And when they did get votes, they got 2/3 of a vote apiece. So the things that affected why it was held on a Tuesday. When people used to travel to the polls by horses, Tuesday was ideal because it allowed people to worship on a Sunday, ride to the country seat on Monday, vote on Tuesday, all before market day on Wednesday.